Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in world history. We're going to continue on with our four-part series on consequences of imperialism. In part one, we looked at unrest in the Balkans, which was looking at how imperialism helped start World War I. In part two here, we're going to move back to Africa, and we're going to specifically look at the events in Rwanda and Darfur. So we're going to revisit our constructive response questions. We've already answered number one in part one, so now we're going to focus on question number two. Question number two says, compare and contrast the events that occurred in Rwanda in 1994 and the events that occurred in Darfur in the early 2000s. So if we move on to our next slide here and look at what we're going to learn, this is still our roadmap. We've already covered the unrest in the Balkans, or the start of World War I, but now we're going to look at genocide in Rwanda and we're going to look at genocide in Darfur. When we come back on part three, we will specifically look at Gandhi and the independence movement as our fourth story. So that's where we're going with all of this, and we'll definitely be able to answer our question as we move through here today. Well, as we know from previous parts of our unit, we know the Europeans have carved up Africa, and that's really going to separate people, bring people together in ways that the African people weren't prepared for. So there's no doubt that the Rwanda genocide is absolutely connected to imperialism, and it's no more evidence than what we see here. Rwanda was controlled by Belgium from 1919 to 1962. You're going to see that the Belgians do some things that really are going to set up conflict later on. For example, Rwanda is really broken up into two different populations. So most of Rwanda's population belong to either the Hutu or Tutsi ethnic groups. And those are going to be very, very important names that you're going to want to understand in this story here. Because for 600 years, these two groups lived and worked and operated together. They shared the business of farming, they shared language, their culture was very similar. The Hutus and the Tutsis got along just fine prior to the Belgians showing up in 1919. Now, demographically, Hutus naturally outnumber Tutsis. That will matter a little bit later in this story, but there are more Hutus than there are Tutsis. But what happened here, here's where imperialism really rears its ugly head, is when the Belgians arrived, they favored the Tutsis as more aristocratic in appearance, and they treated them better, they gave them better jobs, and this drove a political wedge between the two ethnic groups. I mean, you can imagine if you're the Hutus and you know that the Tutsis are being favored, yet you've always kind of seen each other as equals, you're going to start building up some animosity there. You're going to say, why are the Belgians favoring the Tutsis? What are they doing? What's making them better? Why are they getting better grazing ground and more money and things like that? So the Belgians were sort of, without even knowing it, creating a conflict that would occur in the 1990s, long before they even recognized something was really wrong here. So Europeans, of course, also brought new weapons with them. They brought Christianity, which all of these things taught the Hutu to see themselves as oppressed. I mean, they didn't feel they were treated well. They didn't feel they were treated well. And so by the 1950s, the Hutu rebellion had begun. But it's really not going to boil over until the early 1990s. Because on April 6, 1994, the plane carrying Rwanda's president was shot down. And they used this as the trigger needed to really fire up the Hutus' planned final solution. And they started this genocide that occurred in Rwanda. So there had been hatred of the Hutus towards the Tutsis for decades, but now you've got an event here that will actually see them act upon it. And their final solution will involve the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Tutsis. So Hutus killed Tutsis basically mostly with machetes and clubs, killing as many as 800,000 people. A machete is a very awful way to die. Oftentimes when you get slashed with a machete, it takes multiple slashes to kill you, so you can imagine it be a very painful death. Machete by nature is meant to is used to cut your way through a jungle, to cut down thick brush and branches and things like that. It's not a real stabbing weapon, although that can be used. But it's mostly there to cut and to slice. So this was an awful, awful way to die. In my history through film class, as well as I know one of the AP classes that we teach in our building, we do show Hotel Rwanda. It shows one of the courageous stories that occurred as Don Cheadle's character saves a lot of lives by keeping people safe in Rwanda at his hotel. So certainly feel free to check that film out if you haven't seen it. There's a lot of the machetes that were used. I mean, again, you can imagine the brutal death that would follow by being slashed and hacked by a machete. And here's just a couple of startling images that come from Rwanda. Again, 800,000 Tutsis were killed by Hutus in a fairly short amount of time in 1994. Okay, let's finish our story on Rwanda by taking a quick look at question 2 again. The question says, compare and contrast the events that occurred in Rwanda in 1994 and the events that occurred in Darfur in the early 2000s. Now, we can't really answer this question because we don't have the Darfur story yet. But we know about Rwanda, the killing of the Tutsis by the Hutus. 800,000 are killed. This has everything to do with how the Belgians treated the Tutsis and favored them over the Hutus. The Hutus saw themselves as oppressed and eventually had built up a lot of animosity towards the Tutsis and just needed their spark to kind of get things started. And that happened in 1994 when the president's plane was shot down. The Hutus blamed that on the Tutsis and ended up killing 800,000 of them, mostly with machetes in the following weeks. Really, really awful, sad story. Now, when we come back in part 3, we are going to look at Darfur, which is a region of Africa just north of Rwanda, but we're going to see killing going on there as well. So we'll see some similarities and we'll see some differences, and ultimately we're going to use those details to answer question number 2. So that's going to do it for us here on Rwanda. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.